I talked about goodness, everything being good. We hear that in the scriptures. God created everything and it was good. But it's immediately evident. Look at the world, look at your own life, look at the newspapers and everything around you. There's evil in the world. So what is evil? We can talk about that. And we'll talk about it in the context of the fall of human beings, as spoken of in Genesis chapter 3. Evil came into the world through sin. God did not intend for us to die or to suffer, but death and suffering came into the world through sin. Read now Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 24, all of chapter 3. Pay attention especially to the curses given to the man, to the woman, to the serpent, because those curses are expressions of what naturally happens to us because of sin. So we will pause now. There's the verses, and I will see you again soon. Okay, so notice what happens after the fall. This is what we have expressed in the curses. This is what we have expressed in the actions of the man and the woman after they have sinned. Relationships are broken. Relationships with God, with one another, with themselves, and with creation. All of these are wounded. All of these are hurt in deep ways. First of all, we see the wounding of the relationship with God. The man and the woman who before welcomed God hide from him because of their shame, because of the guilt they carry within them, because of their sin. They know that they've done something to offend God, and so they hide away. They can't look him in the face anymore. Then when he comes to them, they push off the blame onto one another and onto the serpent rather than admitting it honestly. Their honesty is broken, this kind of dissimulation and pointing off to the side. No, 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 it wasn't my fault. It was their fault. Their relationship has been deeply, gravely wounded with God. And that is the deepest effect of the fall, closely followed by this next effect, the wounding of the relationship between human beings. Sin wounds our relationship not only with God vertically, but also with other human beings horizontally. What do we see right after the fall? Well, first of all, the man and the woman, they recognize that they are naked. What does that mean? Well, it means that before in their relationship, they could look at the other as a whole person, look at each other with love. Now that's been wounded. They've begun looking at the other as an object, looking with lust, so that they need to cover themselves so that they're not looked at as an object, they're not objectified. Before their whole person, including their sexuality, was included in the gaze of the other. Now they can become a sexual object for the other. And we see that in them covering themselves in their shame. 2, the man blames the woman. God comes and says, "What happened here?" And he says, "This woman that you put here with me," notice the wounding in the relationship with God too. It's her fault, and it's your fault really, because you put her here with me. This woman that you put here with me, she gave me the fruit, and so I ate it. Wounded relationship, blaming the other. Then, in the curse on the woman. Now, the curses are the natural result of sin, not something that God's adding in, but just a recognition of what sin has broken, what sin has done. In the curse on the woman, it says that her desire will be for her husband, and he will lord it over her. Surely we see that throughout history, men lording it over women, right? In general, you could say whoever has the position of power, whoever has the advantage, the stronger over the weaker, always, very often, lords it over the other. If you look at one country that's more powerful than another, taking over that country, perhaps enslaving the people that are there, empire building, masters holding slaves, right? The sad history of human beings lording it over one another, brokenness of relationship. And we see that expressed in the story there in Genesis 3. Sin wounds our relationship up, wounds our relationship horizontally to one another by focusing us back in on ourselves so that our love for ourselves becomes inordinate. We love ourselves in the wrong way now so that we break off our love for one another. But our love for ourselves is also wounded. Our relationship is wounded there by sin. We feel shame again, like it talks about there in the scripture, shame that didn't need to be felt before, shown by hiding from God, hiding from one another. And their bodies are no longer completely under their control. We see this also in what God says to the woman, that now she is going to give birth in great pain, that is going to be difficult now. It would have been easy before. Um, their bodies, in terms of lust and other desires, are no longer under their control entirely. They can be pulled away from what is right and just and desire towards food, for example, by gluttony, too much desire for food. Some desire for food is good in the right way at the right time to the right extent. Um, but now it becomes too much in the wrong way at the wrong time, etc. St. Augustine says that because human beings rejected God who was above them and his authority, they lost their authority over their own bodies, that the authority that they had received over themselves by their love of God is lost by their breaking that relationship there. Wounding of relationship with self, shame, fighting within ourselves, what's called concupiscence, these desires that pull us away from what is true and good. That also is wounded by sin. And lastly, our relationship with creation is also wounded. That's shown by the fact that work is now in the sweat of your brow, and that the earth brings forth thorns and thistles when you try to bring forth food. The earth that was very easy to tend and to care for before now becomes something difficult, something that has to be worked with great labor. Um, when I get back, I'll try to talk about that a little bit more. I've got an example or two that I think are kind of cool on that. So on with these other things. We can talk about these more when I get back. But the point is, the breaking of relationship at all levels is the result of the fall, is the result of our sin. Um, and that brings into the world suffering in one way or another, suffering and death that we now experience. They're a natural result of sin. They're not a separate punishment from God. God didn't say, okay, you sinned, now I'm going to punish you with death. Rather, because we sinned, because we broke our relationship with God, we lost naturally those special benefits that he had given to us by his relationship with us. In order to have life eternally now, we need to be restored in that relationship, and that is the problem. It's a natural result. Death is a natural result of sin. Just as if you step off a cliff, there is the natural result of falling. And death and suffering are not just limited to this life, but even to eternity, because hell is exactly the separation of God from God, separation from God by our own sin, by our own choice. And now, since our first parents broke that relationship, and we're living in a situation, we come into a situation in the world where we're not in relationship with God. How is that relationship going to be restored? That's a dilemma that God has. How is he going to fix this problem, this difficulty? He loves us. He doesn't want us to die. How is he going to solve this dilemma? Death, suffering, hell have come into the world. What does he do? Well, that's why we're going to have the incarnation, God becoming flesh, God coming among us. That is a central step in the move of our salvation, moving us by his taking a body to the Paschal mystery, Christ's death upon the cross, and then his resurrection, by which we have new life. And so that's what we're going to be moving to. We need to talk about creation and the fall, because there we're talking about the goodness of the world that God created, and the fall that brings about the problem, and the problem is solved exactly by the incarnation and the Paschal mystery, which is what we're going to talk to. Now, let's talk a little bit more about original sin. Original sin is really what we were talking about before, the sin of Adam and Eve. But how does it affect us, right? This is the wound that all human beings carry because they're children of Adam and Eve. But we didn't do the sin, right? Adam and Eve did. Why is it something that's carried down to us? How does it affect you and me? Doesn't seem fair, right? Maybe some real way it's not fair, but we see it happen always in the world, often in the world. Think, for example, of the experience of the children of alcoholics. Many people have this experience, having a parent that is alcoholic. And I've seen in the lives of friends the struggles and the difficulties that that can bring about. It causes wounds to have a parent that is an alcoholic, and something that is difficult to overcome. It can be overcome, but it can only be overcome by work. Is that fair that somebody has to suffer that? Well, no, they didn't cause it. And yet it's the reality that if your parents are a certain way, you are going to struggle from that. People in other situations, right, whose parents are other ways, we all carry in some way wounds from the sins of our parents, and we carry those on down to the next generation, and so on. So it takes labor to go beyond that. But it also takes more than labor, more than our own work. It takes the work of God, the work of grace to restore and to heal the brokenness in the world, the brokenness of relationship. And that's exactly what God does. That's exactly the story of the Christian faith. God coming into the world to heal those things that are broken, to restore relationships at all levels, and to bring us back to the fullness of life in Him and with one another forever. That's the whole point of our salvation. God acting in the world, and His action meets our receptivity to that action and brings healing.